If you grew up in the 1970s, you lived a completely different childhood than any generation after you. You left the house in the morning and came back when the streetlights turned on. No one knew where you were. No helmets, no supervision, no constant check-ins. You played outside until you were exhausted, watched whatever was on 3 TV channels, and learned to entertain yourself because boredom was just part of life. Your parents didn't hover. They didn't track your every move. You were raised with a level of freedom that would be considered neglect today, and that shaped you. Not just your memories, but your psychology, the way you handle risk, the way you relate to authority, the way you process boredom and stimulation, the way you connect with people. Growing up in the 1970s created a specific psychological profile, one defined by independence, resilience, adaptability, and a fundamentally different relationship with the world than generations raised in the digital, safety-obsessed era that followed. The unsupervised generation that built self-reliance but also emotional distance. The pre-digital mindset that created presence, patience, and face-to-face connection. And the cultural shift. Survivors who watched the world transform and learned to adapt or resist. Subscribe to that stoic stick because we break down how the era you grew up in shapes the psychology you carry today. Let's decode the psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s. 1. The unsupervised generation. If you grew up in the 1970s, you were unsupervised in ways that seem unimaginable now. You rode your bike across town without telling anyone where you were going. You played in the woods, climbed trees, explored abandoned buildings. Your parents didn't know where you were for hours, sometimes the entire day. There were no cell phones, no GPS tracking, no check-in every hour. You left in the morning and came back for dinner. And that level of freedom or neglect, depending on how you frame it, fundamentally shaped your psychology. It created extreme independence. You learned to solve your own problems because no one was coming to help. You got hurt, you figured it out. You got lost, you found your way home. You had conflicts with other kids, you handled it yourself. There was no running to an adult for intervention. This built self-reliance, resourcefulness, and confidence. You learned early that you could handle things on your own, and that belief became core to your identity. It also created high-risk tolerance. Without constant supervision and safety warnings, you took risks. You did dangerous things, jumped off roofs, rode bikes down steep hills, played with fire. Some of you got hurt, but you also learned that risk isn't automatically catastrophic. You developed an intuitive understanding of danger through experience, not through being told what to avoid. This made you comfortable with uncertainty and less fearful of consequences than generations raised in bubble-wrapped environments. But there's a shadow side. The lack of supervision also created emotional distance. Your parents weren't hovering because they weren't emotionally involved in the way modern parents are. Feelings weren't discussed. Therapy wasn't normalized. You were expected to be tough, handle things, not complain. So you learned to suppress emotions, to not ask for help, to see vulnerability as weakness. That independence came at a cost. Difficulty with emotional intimacy, reluctance to seek support, and a tendency to isolate when struggling. The unsupervised childhood also built resilience through adversity. You experienced failure without safety nets. You learned consequences were real. There was no participation trophy, no one protecting you from disappointment. And while that created toughness, it also created a generation that sometimes lacks empathy for people who need support, viewing emotional needs as weakness rather than humanity. The psychological legacy of the unsupervised generation: strong, independent, self-reliant, but often emotionally guarded and resistant to vulnerability. 2. The pre-digital mindset. People who grew up in the 1970s lived before the internet, before smartphones, before constant connectivity. Entertainment was 3 TV channels, a radio, and whatever you could create yourself. If you were bored, you stayed bored until you figured out something to do. There was no algorithm feeding you content, no infinite scroll, no dopamine hit every 30 seconds. And that shaped your brain in ways that are fundamentally different from digital natives. You developed high boredom tolerance. Boredom wasn't a problem to solve immediately. It was just a state you existed in until something happened. You learned to sit with discomfort, to entertain yourself, to create rather than consume. This built patience, creativity, and the ability to be alone with your thoughts without distraction. Modern generations struggle with this. They need constant stimulation. You don't. You can sit in silence. You can wait without pulling out a phone. That's not discipline. That's how your brain was wired before digital dependency existed. You also developed deep focus. When you read a book, watched a show, or worked on a project, that's all you did. There were no notifications, no multitasking, no second screen. Your attention wasn't fractured across multiple inputs. This created the ability to sustain focus for extended periods, something increasingly rare in younger generations whose attention spans have been shattered by constant digital interruption. Face-to-face social skills are another hallmark. You couldn't hide behind a screen. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called their house and spoke to whoever answered, or you showed up in person. You learned to read body language, tone, social cues. You had real conversations, not text exchanges. This made you better at in-person connection, but sometimes worse at digital communication. You might struggle with texting tone, or find online interaction shallow compared to face-to-face depth. You also have a different relationship with information. Growing up, if you didn't know something, you either asked someone, looked it up in a library, or just didn't know. Information wasn't instant. This created comfort with uncertainty and not knowing everything immediately. You don't feel the same compulsion to Google everything in real time. You're okay with questions left unanswered. The pre-digital mindset created presence, patience, and depth. But it also created resistance to change and sometimes dismissiveness toward digital culture, viewing it as shallow or inferior rather than just different. 3. The cultural shift survivors. If you grew up in the 1970s, you witnessed society transform in real time. You saw the economy collapse and recover. You watched family structures shift. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Single-parent households became common. Traditional roles were questioned. You lived through Watergate and learned that authority figures lie. You saw the optimism of the 60s give way to the cynicism of the 70s, and All of this shaped your psychology in ways that make you fundamentally different from generations raised in more stable or insulated times. You developed adaptability. The world changed fast, and you learned to adjust. Economic instability meant your parents might lose jobs, homes, security. You learned early that nothing is guaranteed. That adaptability became a survival skill. You can pivot, reinvent, handle uncertainty because you've seen stability collapse before. This makes you resilient, but also sometimes cynical about long-term planning or institutional promises. You also developed distrust of authority. Watergate wasn't just a political scandal. It was a generational wake-up call that leaders lie, institutions are corrupt, and the system doesn't protect you. This created a healthy skepticism, but also sometimes a reflexive distrust of government, corporations, and anyone in power. You question everything. You don't take official narratives at face value. That's both a strength and a limitation. Critical thinking versus cynicism. The shifting family structures also affected your psychology. You might have experienced divorce firsthand or watched friends, families fall apart. The nuclear family ideal collapsed, and you learned that relationships aren't permanent, that people leave, that forever is conditional. This created either fierce independence, I don't need anyone, or deep commitment issues, difficulty trusting that relationships will last. Culturally, the 1970s were a strange mix of freedom and disillusionment. The countercultural optimism of the 60s faded. The economic boom was over. There was a sense of things falling apart. And growing up in that environment created a generation that's both resourceful and somewhat pessimistic, adaptable but guarded, independent but skeptical of connection. The cultural shift survivors learned to expect instability, question authority, and rely on themselves. That made you strong, but it also made you hard to reach emotionally. 3. The cultural shift survivors. If you grew up in the 1970s, you witnessed society transform in real time. You saw the economy collapse and recover. You watched family structures shift. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Single-parent households became common. Traditional roles were questioned. You lived through Watergate and learned that authority figures lie. You saw the optimism of the 60s give way to the cynicism of the 70s, and all of this shaped your psychology in ways that make you fundamentally different from generations raised in more stable or insulated times. You developed adaptability. The world changed fast, and you learned to adjust. Economic instability meant your parents might lose jobs, homes, security. You learned early that nothing is guaranteed. That adaptability became a survival skill. You can pivot, reinvent, handle uncertainty because you've seen stability collapse before. This makes you resilient, but also sometimes cynical about long-term planning or institutional promises. You also developed distrust of authority. Watergate wasn't just a political scandal. It was a generational wake-up call that leaders lie, institutions are corrupt, and the system doesn't protect you. This created a healthy skepticism, but also sometimes a reflexive distrust of government, corporations, and anyone in power. You question everything. You don't take official narratives at face value. That's both a strength and a limitation. Critical thinking versus cynicism. The shifting family structures also affected your psychology. You might have experienced divorce firsthand or watched families fall apart. The nuclear family ideal collapsed, and you learned that relationships aren't permanent, that people leave, that forever is conditional. This created either fierce independence, I don't need anyone, or deep commitment issues, difficulty trusting that relationships will last. Culturally, the 1970s were a strange mix of freedom and disillusionment. The countercultural optimism of the 60s faded. The economic boom was over. There was a sense of things falling apart, and growing up in that environment created a generation that's both resourceful and somewhat pessimistic, adaptable but guarded, independent but skeptical of connection. The cultural shift survivors learned to expect instability, question authority, and rely on themselves. That made you strong, but it also made you hard to reach emotionally.